Hello everyone, welcome to the Boring History channel. Make sure you're subscribed so our daily history reaches you without missing a single story tonight. You are about to discover how medieval families survived freezing winter nights without heaters, electricity, or even proper insulation. Some of their methods sound surprisingly clever, while others may leave you wondering how anyone managed to sleep at all. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the story slowly carry you into the coldest nights of the Middle Ages. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. In the heart of winter, long before central heating, electric blankets, or insulated homes, night arrived with a cold that seemed almost alive. As darkness settled over medieval villages, frost crept across wooden walls, icy winds slipped through tiny cracks, and every family knew that surviving the night depended as much on preparation as on sleep itself. The fire burning in the hearth was not simply a comfort, but the center of life, and before anyone even thought about climbing into bed, the household gathered close to its warmth, trying to absorb as much heat as possible before the flames died down. Firewood was precious, especially during the longest winters. So few families could afford to keep a roaring fire burning until dawn. Instead, they allowed it to shrink into glowing embers, hoping the remaining warmth would last through the bitter hours before sunrise. Most ordinary homes were simple timber buildings with dirt or stone floors, and neither material did much to keep out the cold. Roofs were thatched or covered with wooden shingles, and walls often lacked proper insulation. Even wealthier stone houses presented their own problem, because stone absorbed cold throughout the day and released it slowly through the night, making rooms feel damp and icy. Windows were tiny, if they existed at all, and many were covered only with wooden shutters or oiled cloth rather than glass. These small openings reduced drafts but could never completely stop the freezing wind from finding its way inside. Every gust reminded people that winter was something to be endured, not escaped. Beds themselves looked very different from the soft mattresses people know today. A typical bed consisted of a wooden frame, supporting ropes stretched tightly across it, with a mattress filled with straw, dried grasses, feathers, or wool. Resting on top, straw mattresses were inexpensive but flattened quickly and often needed replacing. Wealthier households might enjoy feather beds that trapped body heat far more effectively. But even these offered little protection against the relentless chill without heavy blankets piled on top. Linen sheets touched the skin first, followed by thick woolen blankets that provided most of the insulation. Wool was treasured because its fibers trapped warm air, while still retaining some insulating ability, even when slightly damp. Sharing a bed was completely normal and rarely questioned. Entire families often slept together, not because of affection alone, but because every human body produced valuable warmth. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even guests squeezed into the same sleeping space whenever possible. Body heat became one of the most reliable forms of heating available. Children often slept between adults where they would remain warmest, while infants might be placed in cradles near the parents, or carefully protected within the family's sleeping arrangements. Privacy mattered far less than survival during freezing nights. Animals also played an unexpected role in keeping people warm. In poorer homes, chickens wandered freely indoors, dogs curled beside their owners, and even livestock such as goats or calves might spend particularly cold nights inside the same building. Although separate spaces were sometimes divided by wooden partitions, the warmth generated by animals helped raise the indoor temperature slightly. Their presence also prevented valuable livestock from freezing during severe weather. To modern senses, the smell would have been overwhelming, but medieval families considered it a practical trade-off. Warmth mattered far more than comfort. Before climbing into bed, People often relied on simple methods to preheat their sleeping place. Heated stones wrapped carefully in cloth were tucked beneath blankets to release warmth gradually. In wealthier homes, servants filled metal or ceramic bed warmers with glowing charcoal and slid them between the sheets before bedtime. These warming pans had long handles that allowed them to move safely beneath the blankets without scorching the bedding. Once the bed felt comfortably warm, the pan was removed before anyone climbed inside. Although effective, these devices carried risks, and accidental fires occasionally broke out when carelessness met dry straw mattresses and wooden houses. Clothing worn to bed was surprisingly substantial by modern standards. Rather than changing into thin pajamas, many people simply loosened or removed their outer garments while keeping several layers underneath. Linen nightshirts, woolen caps, thick socks, and sometimes even cloaks remained on throughout the night. Covering the head was particularly important because people believed significant body heat escaped through it. And while modern science shows the head loses heat proportionally like any uncovered body part, a warm cap certainly made cold nights feel more bearable. Hands were sometimes tucked beneath blankets or between the legs to preserve warmth, while sleepers curled tightly into compact positions that reduced heat loss. The sleeping area itself was carefully arranged. Wealthier families owned enclosed beds surrounded by heavy wooden frames and thick curtains. These bed curtains were far more than decorative. Once drawn shut, they trapped warm air around the sleepers and shielded them from drafts sweeping through the room. Entering one of these enclosed beds felt almost like climbing into a small insulated chamber. Some beds were built directly into walls, creating snug sleeping compartments that held warmth even more efficiently. For ordinary villagers without such luxuries, blankets were sometimes hung around beds to imitate the same effect, reducing air movement and creating a small pocket of warmer air. Winter nights were remarkably long, and sleep itself often followed a pattern unfamiliar today. Many historians believe people commonly experienced what has become known as segmented sleep. After several hours of rest, they naturally awoke around midnight or shortly afterward. During this quiet period, they prayed, spoke softly with family members, checked the fire, visited the latrine, or simply reflected in silence before returning to bed for a second period of sleep lasting until dawn. Without artificial lighting disrupting natural rhythms, this pattern may have felt completely ordinary. The long darkness of winter encouraged people to adapt rather than resist the changing length of the night. Food also influenced how comfortably people slept through freezing weather. Evening meals often included thick pottages made from grains, vegetables, beans, and whatever meat was available. These hearty dishes provided slow, burning energy that helped the body maintain warmth overnight. Bread accompanied nearly every meal, while ale was commonly consumed because water quality could be unreliable. Contrary to popular imagination, excessive drinking before bed was not always desirable during harsh winters. Because alcohol creates a temporary sensation of warmth, while actually increasing heat loss from the body, medieval people did not fully understand this physiology. Yet generations of experience taught many that moderation served them better during the coldest nights. The fireplace remained everyone's greatest ally against winter. Throughout the evening, someone regularly adjusted logs, stirred embers, and ensured sparks did not escape onto straw, covered floors. Ashes sometimes covered the remaining coals overnight, slowing combustion and preserving enough heat to restart the fire more easily in the morning. Losing the household fire completely could mean hours of difficult work to rekindle it. So protecting those glowing embers became one of the final tasks before sleep. In many homes, waking before sunrise included immediately reviving the fire to bring life back into the frozen room. Not everyone enjoyed even these modest comforts. Travelers caught outdoors faced terrifying conditions. Inns provided shelter when available, but many roads remained dangerous after snowfall. Those unable to find lodging sometimes sought refuge inside barns, monasteries, or communal buildings. Monasteries frequently offered hospitality to travelers, although space was limited during severe weather. Even inside religious buildings, heating remained minimal, and thick stone walls retained the bitter cold almost as effectively as they preserved silence. Castles, despite their grandeur, were often colder than peasant cottages. Their enormous halls featured high ceilings where precious heat drifted upward, leaving those below shivering despite roaring fireplaces. Lords and ladies depended heavily on tapestries covering stone walls to reduce drafts and add a small layer of insulation. Bedrooms were moved into smaller private chambers whenever possible because they were easier to heat. Massive canopy beds enclosed with heavy curtains created islands of relative warmth inside otherwise freezing rooms. Servants worked constantly carrying firewood, warming beds, and tending fireplaces throughout the evening. Yet even nobility frequently awoke to frosted windows and breath visible in the morning air. Winter also shaped daily routines in subtle ways. People often rose later because daylight arrived slowly, and much work paused during the darkest months. Families spent evenings repairing tools, spinning wool, telling stories, praying, or simply sitting together near the fading fire. Sleep became part of a larger rhythm, dictated entirely by nature. Without thermostats or electric light, every household measured time by sunrise, sunset, and the changing seasons. The cold was not an unexpected inconvenience, but a permanent companion that demanded respect every single year. Despite these hardships, medieval people developed remarkable resilience. Even after every possible precaution had been taken, winter still found countless ways to remind medieval people of its power. During particularly harsh cold spells, moisture from breathing could freeze along the inside of wooden walls, and thin layers of ice sometimes formed on water, left standing overnight. Pitchers placed beside the bed could contain ice by morning, making the first drink of the day painfully cold. Washing before sunrise was uncommon, not only because water had to be heated over the fire, but because exposing bare skin to freezing air was deeply unpleasant. Many people simply wiped their faces with a damp cloth or postponed thorough washing until later in the day, when the fire had been fully revived. Snow itself changed the sounds of the night. Thick blankets of snow-muffled footsteps, carts, and even barking dogs, creating an eerie silence that surrounded isolated villages. Inside their homes, families often listened to the wind pushing against the walls or heard snow sliding from rooftops. Timber houses creaked as wooden beams expanded and contracted with changing temperatures. Every unusual noise could stir sleepers awake, especially when heavy snow threatened to damage roofs, already carrying enormous weight. Men sometimes rose during the night to knock accumulated snow from weaker structures before it caused collapse. Many medieval houses lacked chimneys in the modern sense. Smoke from the central fire often escaped through a hole in the roof, or drifted slowly through the building before finding its way outside. While this made the air smoky, it had one surprising advantage during winter. The lingering warmth from smoke and hot air helped heat the upper portions of the house before escaping, though it also left walls blackened with soot and irritated the eyes and lungs. People simply accepted watery eyes and the smell of smoke as part of everyday life. The quality of firewood mattered enormously. Hardwoods such as oak burned slowly and produced long-lasting embers, ideal for winter nights, while softer woods flared brightly but disappeared quickly. Families carefully stacked and dried firewood throughout warmer months because wet wood burned poorly and created excessive smoke. Running out of wood during winter was considered a serious crisis. In some regions, Collecting fallen branches from forests was strictly regulated by local lords, meaning poor families sometimes risked punishment for gathering enough fuel to survive. Stories survive of villagers secretly collecting dead wood after dark, hoping to avoid fines while keeping their children warm. Blankets themselves represented significant wealth. Producing wool required raising sheep, shearing them, cleaning the fleece, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and finally sewing thick coverings. A household with several heavy wool blankets possessed something valuable that might be passed from one generation to the next. Families often repaired worn blankets repeatedly rather than replacing them. Patches, stitched corners, and carefully mended holes were common sights, because every layer contributed to surviving another winter. People also became surprisingly skilled at recognizing the warmest places inside a house. Sleeping directly against an outside wall was avoided whenever possible, because the stone or timber radiated cold throughout the night. Beds were positioned near the hearth, but not so close that sparks posed a danger. In larger homes, upper floors could sometimes remain slightly warmer because heat naturally rose from the fire below, although drafts through the roof occasionally reversed that advantage. Every home developed its own unwritten map of warm and cold corners, knowledge shared among family members without needing explanation. Children experienced winter differently from adults. Youngsters often played in snow during daylight despite the cold, but nighttime demanded careful attention. Mothers wrapped babies tightly in layers of cloth, believing firm swaddling protected both warmth and proper growth. Cradles were positioned near the fire during the evening, but moved to safer locations before everyone fell asleep, reducing the risk of accidents. Older children frequently slept side by side beneath the same blanket, giggling and whispering until exhaustion finally overcame them. Even in difficult times, childhood found moments of joy. Illness spread more easily during winter because families spent long periods crowded together indoors. Smoke filled air irritated lungs already weakened by cold weather, and respiratory infections could move quickly through households sharing the same sleeping space. Medieval medicine offered few effective treatments for diseases that flourished during winter. Herbal teas, warmed wine mixed with spices, honey, garlic, onions, and countless traditional remedies were prepared in hopes of easing coughs or fevers. Rest near the fire remained one of the few comforts available. For monks and nuns living in monasteries, winter nights were shaped by religious discipline. Their sleeping quarters were usually simple and intentionally modest. Thick blankets were allowed, but luxury was discouraged. Monastic rules often required members to rise long before dawn for prayers, even during the coldest months. Imagine leaving a warm blanket while frost covered the stone floor beneath bare feet. Candles flickered in dark corridors as sleepy monks gathered in freezing chapels to chant before returning briefly to their daily duties. Faith often demanded endurance that rivaled the weather itself. In Northern Europe, where winters could last for months, people sometimes stuffed cracks in walls with moss, straw, wool scraps, or animal hair to reduce drafts. Doorways were covered with thick fabric or animal hides that acted as primitive insulation. Floors received fresh layers of rushes or straw, creating a small barrier between icy ground and human feet. These materials were replaced periodically because they became dirty over time. But during winter, every extra layer helped preserve precious warmth. Nighttime clothing was sometimes warmed before bed by hanging garments close to the fire. Pulling on cold clothes in the morning could be almost painful, especially when fabric had become stiff from freezing temperatures. Those fortunate enough to have servants often found their clothing already warmed before they dressed. Ordinary families simply endured the shock, sometimes holding garments near the rekindled fire before putting them on. Stories told around the fire often lasted until people became too tired to continue. Winter evenings encouraged storytelling because outdoor work largely stopped after sunset. Grandparents recounted local legends, heroic battles, saints' lives, mysterious forest spirits, and tales explaining strange winter sounds. Children listened while wrapped beneath blankets, the fire casting moving shadows across wooden walls. These stories entertained but also preserved history, beliefs, and practical lessons about surviving harsh seasons. Travelers arriving after dark were usually welcomed with remarkable generosity, particularly during severe winters. Refusing shelter could easily become a death sentence in freezing conditions. A place beside the fire, a bowl of hot stew, and a corner of the floor beneath shared blankets might save someone's life. Hospitality carried strong moral and religious importance, partly because everyone understood they themselves might someday depend on the kindness of strangers. The psychological challenge of winter was just as real as the physical cold. Weeks of grey skies, limited daylight, and constant confinement tested patience within crowded households. Arguments undoubtedly occurred, yet so did cooperation. Families depended on one another for nearly every aspect of survival, from collecting firewood to repairing clothing and preparing meals. Shared hardship strengthened many communities because isolation was rarely an option. Some winters became legendary for their severity. Rivers froze solid enough to walk across. Crops failed beneath heavy snow, and food supplies dwindled before spring arrived. During such years, sleep became lighter as hunger joined the cold. Empty stomachs made it harder for the body to stay warm, and families sometimes burned furniture or wooden tools after exhausting their firewood supply. These desperate measures reflected how closely survival balanced on preparation and fortune. When spring finally arrived, the first warm nights felt almost miraculous. Heavy blankets were folded away, bed curtains remained open, and windows could finally admit fresh air instead of icy drafts. Yet every family knew another winter would come. Throughout the warmer months, they repaired roofs, gathered wood, spun wool, preserved food, and strengthened their homes, because they remembered exactly how the cold had felt. Medieval sleep during winter was never something taken for granted. Every peaceful night represented another small victory over freezing temperatures, scarce resources, and the relentless challenges of a world where warmth had to be earned one log, one blanket, and one glowing ember at a time. As the coldest part of the night settled in, usually just before dawn, even the warmest beds began to lose the heat they had gathered earlier. This was often the most uncomfortable time to be asleep. The fire had almost completely burned down, the walls had cooled for hours, and every blanket had gradually released its stored warmth. Many people instinctively curled into a tight position, drawing their knees toward their chest to reduce the amount of skin exposed to the cold air. Couples and family members shifted closer together without fully waking, seeking the warmth of another person's body almost automatically. It was a simple act repeated night after night through generations, requiring no explanation because everyone understood its purpose. The air inside a medieval bedroom could become surprisingly stale, with windows tightly shut against the freezing wind and little ventilation during the night. Smoke from the hearth, moisture from breathing, and the scent of damp wool filled the room. Yet opening a window was almost never worth the loss of precious warmth. Fresh air, while desirable, was considered a luxury during the harshest winters. People accepted smoky rooms because warmth always came first. Some homes contained only a single heated room where every activity took place. Cooking, eating, repairing tools, spinning wool, telling stories, praying and sleeping, all happened within the same shared space. During the day, benches and stools surrounded the hearth. At night, mattresses filled with straw were laid directly on the floor or placed on simple wooden frames. By morning, they were often rolled up again to create space for daily work. The idea of separate bedrooms for each family member was far beyond the reach of most medieval households. The wealthy enjoyed more comfortable sleeping arrangements, but even their lives were far from luxurious by modern standards. Noble families often travelled between castles throughout the year, and many residences stood empty for months. Arriving at a stone castle in winter meant entering rooms that had been cold for weeks. Servants spent hours lighting dozens of fires before the chambers became even moderately comfortable. Thick tapestries were hung not only because they displayed wealth, but because they trapped pockets of air against freezing stone walls, reducing heat loss. Without these woven coverings, the walls themselves almost seemed to radiate cold into the room. Fur was another treasured defense against winter. Wealthier individuals slept beneath blankets, lined with animal pelts such as fox, rabbit, marten, or squirrel. These furs trapped warm air exceptionally well and added another protective layer between the sleeper and the icy surroundings. Fur-lined cloaks often doubled as extra bedding during particularly severe nights. Poorer families sometimes used sheepskins or untreated animal hides if they were available, though these were much rougher and less comfortable than finely prepared furs owned by the nobility. The sounds inside the house changed throughout the night. Logs shifted in the dying fire with quiet cracks, embers occasionally popped, and sleeping animals stirred from one corner to another. Dogs often acted as natural alarms, raising their heads whenever they heard movement outside. Cats curled beside the warm ashes of the hearth, preferring the fading heat over any blanket. Chickens tucked beneath benches occasionally fluttered their wings, while larger animals housed nearby shuffled against wooden partitions. These familiar noises reassured families that life continued safely through another cold night. Many people believed that cold itself could directly cause illness. Medieval medicine was based on theories very different from modern science, particularly the balance of the body's four humours. Physicians often advised keeping the body warm to maintain proper balance and avoid disease. Although they misunderstood the biological causes of infections, staying warm genuinely did reduce some risks associated with extreme cold. Herbal infusions made from rosemary, thyme, sage, mint, or chamomile were commonly consumed before bed, partly for comfort and partly because they were believed to strengthen the body against winter ailments. Candles were expensive, and even those who could afford them rarely wasted them after bedtime. Once everyone settled beneath the blankets, darkness became nearly complete, except for the faint orange glow from dying embers. The medieval night was truly dark, in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Without electric lights from nearby towns or streets, the only illumination came from the moon, stars, or the last traces of fire. On cloudy winter nights, people often could not see their own hands once the fire faded. This complete darkness encouraged sleep and reinforced natural rhythms that followed the rising and setting of the sun. Dreams held deep meaning for many medieval people. They often believed dreams could contain messages from God, warnings about the future, or reflections of a person's moral state. A vivid dream experienced during a long winter night might be discussed seriously the following morning. Monks sometimes recorded unusual dreams in manuscripts, while ordinary villagers shared them with neighbours or local priests, hoping to understand their significance. The quiet isolation of winter nights seemed to give dreams an even greater sense of mystery. Storms could transform bedtime into a tense experience. Strong winter winds rattled shutters, pushed smoke back down through roof openings, and occasionally tore thatch from rooftops. Families lay awake listening to the weather, wondering whether the house would withstand another night. Snowdrifts sometimes blocked doors completely by morning, trapping people indoors until paths could be cleared. Heavy snowfall also threatened food supplies, making every storm a reminder of how dependent they were on the preparations made during autumn. Even the position of the bed reflected practical thinking. Beds were often built higher off the floor because cold air settled near the ground. Raising the mattress even a short distance helped sleepers remain slightly warmer. The space beneath the bed also provided storage for clothing, blankets, baskets, or tools, making efficient use of limited room. Some people even believed that keeping belongings beneath the bed helped block cold air from circulating underneath. During especially severe winters, people sometimes delayed going to bed despite their exhaustion. Remaining awake beside the fire meant enjoying its warmth a little longer before facing the colder conditions of bed once the flames weakened. Family conversations naturally lasted longer on these nights, not necessarily because there was more to say, but because nobody wished to leave the comforting glow of the hearth. Eventually, however, fatigue overcame hesitation, and one by one they disappeared beneath thick blankets until only the crackling embers remained. Morning brought no immediate relief. Climbing out of bed meant stepping into air that could feel almost as cold as the outdoors. Many people dressed quickly beneath their blankets before exposing themselves to the room. The first person awake usually hurried to stir the embers, adding dry kindling and gently blowing until flames returned. The familiar smell of fresh smoke signaled the beginning of another day. Soon a pot of porridge or broth hung above the fire, warming both the room and the people gathered around it. Winter measured time differently. Nights stretched for 14 or 15 hours in some regions, giving families far more darkness than daylight. Yet these long nights were not viewed as wasted time. They allowed for extra rest after demanding harvest seasons, encouraged storytelling that preserved local traditions, and reinforced close family bonds created by sharing warmth in confined spaces. The cold imposed limits, but it also shaped a slower rhythm of life centered on patience, endurance, and cooperation. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to imagine medieval winters as nothing but misery. Yet people adapted with remarkable ingenuity. They designed homes around the hearth, crafted clothing from natural fibers that retained heat, perfected methods of preserving fire overnight, relied on shared body warmth, and passed practical knowledge from one generation to the next. They accepted hardships that would seem extraordinary today because they knew no alternative. For them, winter sleep was not about perfect comfort, but about waking up alive when the first pale light of morning finally crept across the frozen landscape once again. For many medieval families, preparing for a winter night's sleep actually began months earlier. Throughout late spring and summer, every opportunity to gather resources was carefully used because everyone understood that the comfort of December depended on the work completed in July. Woodcutters spent long days felling trees, knowing freshly cut timber needed months to dry before it would burn efficiently. Women spun wool into yarn that would eventually become blankets, socks, cloaks, and sleeping caps. Farmers harvested straw after the grain was collected, setting aside the cleanest bundles to refill mattresses before the cold season arrived. Every chore performed under the warm summer sun was, in some way, an investment in surviving winter nights. When the first frosts appeared, households inspected every part of the home. Loose roof thatching was repaired before snow could force its way inside. Gaps between wooden planks were stuffed with moss, clay, or twisted straw. Broken shutters were fixed to prevent icy winds from entering through the windows. Even tiny cracks mattered. A draft that seemed insignificant during autumn could become unbearable after weeks of freezing weather. Medieval people became experts at noticing where cold air entered a room often holding a candle near suspected gaps and watching the flame bend in the breeze. The fireplace demanded constant attention throughout winter. Children were often taught from an early age how to safely carry kindling, stack logs, or sweep ashes without disturbing glowing embers. Fire was respected almost like another member of the household. It cooked meals, provided light, dried wet clothing, heated water, protected against illness, and made sleep possible. Allowing the fire to go out completely could mean borrowing burning coals from a neighbor the following morning, something most families preferred to avoid if possible. In isolated villages after heavy snowfall, a neighboring house might be difficult to reach, making the preservation of embers even more important. Some people relied on unusual sources of warmth that would seem strange today. Large earthenware jugs filled with hot water were occasionally placed beneath blankets where available. Smooth river stones were heated beside the fire before being wrapped carefully in cloth to avoid burns. Bricks warmed in the hearth served a similar purpose. These objects slowly released stored heat over several hours, helping beds remain comfortable during the first part of the night. Of course, they cooled long before morning, but by then, body heat trapped beneath thick blankets often maintained enough warmth to remain asleep. One challenge that modern homes rarely experience was condensation inside bedding. As sleepers breathed throughout the night, moisture accumulated beneath heavy blankets. Combined with cold air leaking into the room, bedding sometimes became damp after many consecutive nights. Whenever sunny winter days appeared, families eagerly carried blankets outdoors, hanging them across fences or bushes to dry in the crisp air. Even weak winter sunlight helped remove moisture and freshen fabrics. A dry blanket always felt warmer than a damp one. The elderly faced particular difficulties during winter. Aging bodies produced less heat and often struggled to maintain a comfortable temperature through the night. Grandparents were frequently given the warmest position near the fire or placed between younger family members while sleeping. Communities recognized that older people were especially vulnerable during severe cold spells. Neighbors checked on one another more frequently, sharing extra firewood or food whenever possible. Survival often depended as much on kindness as on preparation. Infants required constant vigilance. Medieval parents understood that babies could become dangerously cold far more quickly than adults, even if they did not understand the biological reasons. Mothers often woke repeatedly throughout the night to check their children, adjusting blankets or moving closer if the room became colder. These interruptions meant many parents never enjoyed uninterrupted sleep during winter. Instead, their nights became a repeating cycle of feeding, comforting, checking the fire, and returning to bed. Outside, winter transformed the landscape into a place both beautiful and intimidating. Moonlight reflected brilliantly from snow-covered fields, making the countryside appear almost silver. Bare tree branches cast long shadows across frozen ground, while rivers flowed silently beneath sheets of ice. Wolves were more likely to approach villages during particularly hard winters in search of food, and stories of hearing distant howls while lying awake beneath blankets became part of local folklore. Whether every tale was true mattered less than the feeling they inspired. Winter nights carried an unmistakable sense of mystery. The cold also affected sleep in unexpected ways. Without modern insulation, temperatures inside the house could change noticeably over just a few hours. A room that felt pleasantly warm at bedtime might become uncomfortably cold before dawn. People learned to judge how many blankets they would need based on the evening wind, the appearance of the sky, or the amount of frost forming before sunset. These observations came from experience rather than science, but they were often surprisingly accurate. Shoes were rarely worn to bed, but they were carefully placed where they would remain as warm and dry as possible. Leather stiffened when frozen, making it difficult to put on in the morning. Some families tucked footwear beneath blankets or close enough to the hearth that it would not freeze overnight. Pulling frozen boots onto bare feet before beginning the day's work was an unpleasant experience. Nobody welcomed. Even sleeping posture became influenced by necessity. Medieval illustrations occasionally show people sleeping in positions that seem unusual today, sometimes partly upright against bolsters. While artistic conventions explain some of these images, slightly elevated positions also reduced contact with cold bedding and could help those suffering from winter coughs breathe more comfortably. Thick feather pillows, where available, provided insulation beneath the head, while heavy wool blankets covered nearly every other part of the body. Winter festivals brought brief moments of relief from the hardships of the season. Around celebrations such as Christmas, families who could afford it burned larger fires, prepared richer meals, and remained awake longer singing, praying, or sharing stories. Guests crowded into homes, bringing not only conversation but additional body heat. These gatherings reminded communities that winter, although harsh, was also a season of togetherness. Once the celebrations ended, ordinary routines returned, but the memory of laughter around a bright fire helped lighten the long week still ahead. Many medieval people judged the severity of winter by comparing it with previous years. Older villagers became living records of memorable seasons, recalling the year rivers froze solid enough for wagons to cross, or the winter when snow remained until spring planting. Around evening fires, these stories mixed practical advice with legend, creating a collective memory that helped younger generations prepare for whatever the next winter might bring. For those living in mountain regions, winter sleep carried additional dangers. Avalanches, heavy snowfall, and blocked mountain passes could isolate entire communities for weeks. Families became completely dependent on the food, firewood, and supplies stored before the first snowfall. Running out of fuel meant dismantling fences, wooden furniture, or even parts of unused buildings simply to feed the fire. Every remaining log represented another night of warmth. Despite everything, people found comfort in familiar routines. The same blankets were folded each morning and spread again each evening. The same fire was coaxed back to life before sunrise. The same prayers were whispered before sleep, asking for protection through another freezing night. These small rituals brought a sense of stability in a season that constantly reminded people of nature's immense power. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval winter sleep was not the discomfort, but the resilience it revealed. Generation after generation adapted without thermometers, insulation foam, electric heaters, or weather forecasts. They relied on observation, experience, craftsmanship, and one another. A warm bed was not something purchased with the push of a button, but something created through months of careful preparation, skilled hands, shared effort, and respect for the changing seasons. Every morning that a family awoke, healthy beneath frost-covered roofs, was quiet proof that their knowledge, patience, and determination had carried them safely through yet another bitter winter night. As winter deepened, and the days grew shorter, bedtime often arrived astonishingly early by modern standards. Without bright artificial lighting to extend the evening, many families finished their final chores soon after sunset. A few candles or an oil lamp provided only limited light, and both were expensive enough that they were used sparingly. Once supper had been eaten, and the animals checked for the night, there was little practical reason to remain awake. The long winter darkness naturally encouraged longer periods of rest, even if that rest was interrupted during the middle of the night. Before anyone settled into bed, one final inspection of the house was often made. Doors were secured with heavy wooden bars, shutters were fastened tightly against the wind, and any tools left outdoors were brought inside. If possible, buckets of water were placed where they would be least likely to freeze completely before morning. If snow had begun falling heavily, someone might step outside one last time to judge how much had accumulated, knowing that the next morning could begin with hours of shoveling paths or clearing access to barns. In many villages, silence spread quickly after nightfall. Unlike modern towns filled with traffic, machinery, and electric lights, a medieval winter night could become almost completely still. Occasionally, a church bell marked the passing hours, reminding those awake that time continued moving through the darkness. The distant barking of a dog or the creaking of frozen tree branches carried surprisingly far through the crisp air. For people lying beneath thick blankets, these sounds became familiar companions throughout the winter season. Even pests behaved differently during winter. Rats and mice searched desperately for warmth and food, sometimes finding both inside human homes. Straw mattresses and stored grain attracted unwanted visitors, and sleepers occasionally heard scratching beneath the floor or inside walls. Cats earned their place in many households by helping control these animals, spending much of the night quietly hunting around the edges of the room. A good mouser was appreciated, not only because it protected food supplies, but because it reduced disturbances during the night. Blankets were arranged with surprising care. Rather than simply throwing them over the bed, families layered them strategically. A linen sheet lay closest to the skin because it was softer and easier to wash than wool. Above that came several wool blankets of varying thickness. In particularly cold regions, animal skins might form the outermost layer, trapping even more warmth inside. During exceptionally bitter nights, extra cloaks, capes, or spare clothing were spread across the bed to create additional insulation. Every layer reduced the amount of warm air escaping into the room. People also learned that remaining dry was essential for staying warm. Anyone returning home with snow-covered boots or damp clothing immediately tried to dry them near the fire. Sleeping in wet garments could rapidly chill the body once the fire burned low. Boots were stuffed with straw to absorb moisture. Gloves were hung from wooden pegs beside the hearth, and cloaks were carefully turned so every part could dry before morning. These simple habits often meant the difference between comfort and misery the following night. Children sometimes complained about sharing beds with brothers, sisters, or cousins, especially in crowded households where personal space barely existed. Yet those same children would likely have found sleeping alone far colder. Shared blankets held heat much more effectively than those covering a single person. Parents understood this from experience, even without knowing the science behind it. Warmth increased as more bodies occupied the same sleeping space, turning necessity into an accepted part of family life. Some medieval households owned large wooden chests positioned near the bed. These stored valuable clothing, blankets, important documents, or treasured possessions during the day. At night, the chest itself provided another practical benefit by blocking drafts that entered through walls or doors. Furniture was often arranged not merely for convenience, but also to improve warmth inside the room. The smell of a winter bedroom would have been very different from what people experience today. Smoke from the hearth lingered in fabrics. Fresh straw carried an earthy scent. Wool blankets held the faint smell of sheep. Beeswax candles released a sweet aroma when burned, and herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or dried mint were sometimes tucked into bedding to freshen the air. Combined with the scents of wood, leather, damp boots, and cooking fires, these smells formed the familiar atmosphere of medieval domestic life. Heavy snowfall occasionally created an unexpected advantage. Thick snow accumulating against the outside walls acted as a natural insulating layer, reducing the effect of icy winds. While snow could certainly cause practical problems, It also trapped pockets of air that slowed heat loss from the building. Families may not have understood the physics involved, but they certainly noticed that some snowy nights felt quieter and slightly less drafty than those dominated by freezing winds. Winter clothing rarely belonged to just one person. Cloaks, blankets, scarves, and sleeping caps were valuable possessions that often passed from parents to children over many years. Worn garments were patched repeatedly. Sleeves were shortened or lengthened as children grew, and pieces of damaged blankets became mittens, socks, or padding inside boots. Nothing useful was wasted, because replacing textiles demanded enormous amounts of labor. The cold influenced even conversations before bed. Families frequently discussed the weather, wondering how much longer winter might last, or whether enough firewood remained until spring. Older relatives predicted coming weather by observing cloud shapes, wind direction, or the behavior of birds and livestock. Although these predictions were not always correct, generations of observation had taught them patterns that often proved surprisingly reliable. Occasionally, someone became responsible for waking during the night to check the fire. This duty often fell to an older child or an adult who naturally slept lightly. They would quietly rise, stir the embers, perhaps add a small piece of wood, if supplies allowed, and then return beneath the blankets before losing too much body heat. Such interruptions became routine during especially cold weeks, helping preserve enough warmth that everyone else could continue sleeping. The first rays of winter sunlight rarely brought immediate warmth. Even after dawn, frost often remained thick across fields, rooftops, and trees for hours. Inside the house, the room gradually brightened long before it became comfortable. People gathered around the newly revived fire while rubbing warmth back into stiff hands and feet. Breakfast was simple but filling, often consisting of porridge, coarse bread, leftover stew, or cheese, all chosen to provide energy for another day of working in the cold. Looking back across the centuries, one truth becomes remarkably clear. Medieval people did not survive freezing winters because they possessed extraordinary technology. They survived because every aspect of their daily lives was shaped by experience. Their houses, furniture, clothing, bedding routines, meals, and even sleeping arrangements evolved slowly through countless winters of trial and error. Knowledge passed from grandparents to parents, and then to children, each generation adding small improvements that made the next winter just a little easier to endure. Night after night, year after year, they faced temperatures that entered their homes, settled into their walls, and crept beneath their doors. Yet every evening they rebuilt their defenses with glowing embers, thick wool blankets, shared body heat, carefully dried clothing, and habits refined over centuries. Sleep was never separated from survival. Every peaceful hour beneath heavy blankets represented a quiet victory against a season that showed little mercy. When spring finally returned and the last patches of snow disappeared from the fields, families knew they had accomplished something remarkable. They had once again endured months of freezing nights, using little more than fire, wool, timber, determination, and the timeless comfort of sleeping close to the people they loved. There was also the constant challenge of keeping bedding clean throughout the winter months. During warmer seasons, mattresses could be carried outdoors, emptied, refilled, and aired with relative ease. Winter made this much more difficult. Straw mattresses gradually compressed under the weight of nightly use, becoming thinner and less comfortable. Families occasionally shook the straw inside to redistribute it more evenly, creating a slightly softer sleeping surface without replacing the filling entirely. Feather beds required regular fluffing so that the feathers would continue trapping pockets of warm air. These simple maintenance routines helped preserve both comfort and insulation during the long cold season. Medieval people paid close attention to the behavior of their livestock during winter, because animals often sensed changes in the weather before humans noticed them. If horses became unusually restless, dogs refused to remain outdoors, or chickens gathered unusually close together, many believed another severe cold spell was approaching. Such observations influenced how much firewood was brought inside before bedtime, or whether additional blankets should be prepared. These practices blended practical experience with traditional beliefs passed down over generations. In households with several generations living together, sleeping arrangements could change depending on who was most vulnerable. An elderly grandparent recovering from illness might temporarily receive the family's thickest blankets. A young mother with a newborn could be given the warmest place nearest the fire. Such decisions reflected the collective nature of medieval family life. Resources were limited, so they were distributed according to need rather than individual ownership. Many people today imagine medieval nights as completely silent. But winter storms could create extraordinary sounds. Wind whistled through tiny openings. Loose roof timbers groaned under pressure, and frozen branches scraped against walls or shutters. During blizzards, snow striking the side of a building sometimes sounded almost like handfuls of sand thrown against wood. Children occasionally became frightened by these unfamiliar noises, prompting parents to reassure them with stories, prayers, or simple explanations rooted in local tradition. The moon played a far greater role in nighttime life than it does today. On nights when the moon shone brightly across fresh snow, the landscape became surprisingly visible even without lanterns. Travelers often preferred beginning journeys before dawn under a full moon, because its reflected light illuminated roads and fields. Inside the house, faint moonlight slipping through shutters sometimes outlined furniture and sleeping figures, providing just enough light for someone to move quietly without disturbing others. Certain winter nights carried special importance within medieval communities. During religious feast days, families often remained awake longer than usual, despite the cold. Churches held evening services illuminated by candles, and villagers wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks before walking through snow-covered paths to attend. Returning home afterward, they gathered around the fire once more, grateful for its warmth after standing in chilly stone churches where breath often remained visible throughout the service. People also developed remarkable skill at reading a fire. Experienced adults could judge whether glowing embers would survive until morning simply by their color arrangement and the type of wood still burning. They knew when ashes should be spread gently across the coals to slow the fire, and when additional fuel was absolutely necessary despite limited supplies. These decisions came from years of observation rather than written instruction. A well-managed hearth represented practical wisdom accumulated over countless winters. Even simple household objects were designed with winter in mind. Wooden cups felt warmer to hold than metal ones. Thick ceramic bowls retained the heat of soup longer than thin pottery. Benches positioned beside the hearth often featured high backs that shielded occupants from drafts. Small details like these gradually evolved because they made daily life slightly more comfortable during the coldest months. When someone became seriously ill during winter, the sleeping area often transformed into a place of care. Family members added every available blanket, heated stones more frequently, and ensured the patient remained close to the fire whenever possible. Herbal poultices were applied, warm broths prepared, and prayers offered through the long night. Since professional physicians rarely visited ordinary villagers, nursing largely depended upon relatives whose knowledge came from family tradition and local experience. Snow sometimes created complete isolation. Villages located in forests or mountainous regions could remain cut off for days after particularly heavy storms. During these periods, Households depended entirely on whatever food and fuel they had stored. Nights became especially precious because every log burned reduced the remaining supply. Families often accepted cooler indoor temperatures rather than exhausting their firewood before winter ended. Endurance became a daily calculation, balancing present comfort against future survival. Not everyone slept indoors every night. Shepherds protecting valuable flocks, watchmen guarding town gates, and travelers caught between villages occasionally spent winter nights in simple shelters, barns, or guardhouses. These places offered little warmth beyond a small fire and thick cloaks wrapped tightly around the body. Many developed the habit of sleeping in short intervals, waking frequently to restore the fire or ensure animals remained safe. Their sleep was lighter and more fragmented than that enjoyed by families resting at home. The stars above medieval Europe appeared extraordinarily bright during clear winter nights. Without electric lights obscuring the sky, constellations stretched brilliantly from horizon to horizon. Farmers, shepherds, sailors, and travelers knew many of these stars well, using them to judge direction, time, and even seasonal changes. Looking through a small opening before returning to bed, someone might have admired the glittering winter sky while pulling a cloak tighter against the freezing air before quickly retreating indoors. Over the centuries, regional traditions shaped winter sleeping habits in different ways. Northern communities often emphasized thicker insulation, heavier furs, and more substantial timber houses. In milder regions, homes relied less on massive bedding, but still centered family life around the hearth during colder months. Despite these differences, one pattern remained nearly universal across medieval Europe. Warmth was rarely achieved alone. Families gathered together, slept together, worked together, and endured winter together. Perhaps the greatest misconception about medieval winters is that people constantly complained about the cold. In reality, winter was simply an expected part of life. Children grew up learning exactly how to prepare for it. Adults accepted that certain months demanded extra effort and caution. Their expectations were shaped by the world they knew, not by modern standards of comfort. A warm meal, a sturdy roof, dry blankets, and a dependable fire represented success rather than luxury. As another winter evening came to an end, the familiar sequence repeated itself almost unchanged from one generation to the next. The last bowl was washed, the final prayer spoken, the fire carefully arranged, shutters secured against the wind, and blankets pulled high beneath sleeping caps outside. Frost spread silently across fields and forests, while snow reflected the pale light of the moon. Inside, beneath layers of wool and linen, surrounded by family and protected by the fading glow of the hearth, medieval people surrendered to sleep once more. They knew the night would be long, the morning would be cold, and the work of surviving winter would begin again with the first crackling flames of a newly awakened fire. As winter settled into its longest stretch, people also learned to recognize subtle differences in the cold itself. A dry, clear night often felt different from one filled with damp air. Moisture could creep into clothing, bedding, and wooden walls, making everything seem colder even if the temperature was not as low. Villagers might step outside before bed, glance at the stars, feel the air on their faces, and quietly predict how uncomfortable the night would become. Experience served as their weather forecast, guiding countless small decisions that made sleeping through the night a little easier. One of the greatest enemies of warmth was an unexpected draft. A tiny opening no wider than a finger could send a narrow stream of freezing air directly across a bed for hours. Families constantly searched for these invisible currents. Pieces of cloth, bundles of straw, animal wool, or clay were pressed into gaps wherever cold air entered. Even after repairs, strong winter winds often found new paths inside, forcing people to adapt again and again. Medieval homes were never perfectly sealed, but they became better protected through years of patient maintenance. The wooden beams supporting many houses expanded during warmer months and shrank as winter dried them. This movement created faint popping and cracking noises throughout the night. Children unfamiliar with these sounds sometimes imagined spirits or mysterious visitors wandering through the house. Parents usually smiled, explaining that the house itself was simply responding to the cold. Such explanations became part of everyday family life, blending observation with local folklore. Many communities believed the hours just before sunrise were the coldest because evil forces were strongest before daylight returned. While these beliefs belonged to medieval superstition, they also happened to coincide with reality. Temperatures usually reached their lowest point shortly before dawn, making that final part of the night especially difficult. People who awoke during these hours often tucked blankets more tightly around themselves, briefly stirred the fire if necessary, and waited patiently for the first signs of morning. Even simple breathing changed in winter. Sleeping close to another person meant sharing slightly warmer air beneath heavy blankets. The enclosed space trapped moisture and heat, creating a tiny climate that felt far more comfortable than the room itself. On exceptionally cold mornings, lifting the blankets released a cloud of warm air that disappeared instantly into the freezing bedroom. It was a small reminder of how effectively layers of wool and shared body heat had protected them through the night. Household routines changed remarkably little from one evening to the next. Consistency itself became a form of comfort. The same stool sat beside the fire. The same kettle hung above the flames. The same blankets were folded in the same order, and the same prayers were whispered before sleep. These familiar habits provided stability during a season that could otherwise feel unpredictable and unforgiving. Many medieval craftsmen spent long winter evenings repairing the very objects that helped people sleep. Rope makers twisted new cords to support sagging bed frames. Carpenters replaced cracked wooden slats. Weavers mended worn blankets, one careful stitch at a time. Leather workers patched old boots that would soon face frozen roads again. Winter slowed farming, allowing other skills to flourish inside warm workshops where glowing fires provided enough heat to continue working, despite the weather outside. The smell of burning wood varied depending on the type of tree feeding the fire. Oak produced a rich, steady warmth with a familiar, earthy scent. Beech burned brightly and cleanly. Applewood released a sweeter fragrance that lingered pleasantly inside the house. Families often recognized different woods by smell alone, associating certain scents with particular seasons, celebrations, or memories. A crackling fire was not only a source of heat, but also part of the sensory experience of winter itself. For children, bedtime often became a lesson in practical wisdom. They watched parents carefully fold blankets to trap warm air, learned why wet shoes should never remain near the bed, discovered how to place extra straw beneath sleeping mats, and understood why every ember in the fireplace deserved respect. These lessons rarely came through formal instruction. Instead, they were absorbed naturally by observing adults repeat the same actions every winter. In larger villages, neighbors occasionally visited one another after supper, despite the cold. Such visits were usually brief, because walking through snow after dark was difficult, but they strengthened community ties. Someone might borrow a little flour, exchange news from another village, or simply enjoy conversation beside a larger fire before returning home. During especially severe winters, these visits also allowed neighbors to quietly check whether elderly people or widows had enough fuel and food to continue through the coming week. Not all bedding was soft. Poor families often slept on mattresses that gradually became uneven as straw shifted beneath them. Small pieces of straw poked through the fabric, creating lumpy, sleeping surfaces that modern people would find uncomfortable. Yet exhaustion from long days of work usually overcame these inconveniences. After hours spent gathering wood, caring for animals, or repairing buildings in freezing weather, many people fell asleep quickly despite imperfect conditions. Frost sometimes decorated the inside edges of windows or shutters with delicate patterns that resembled tiny trees, feathers, or flowers. Medieval people had no scientific explanation for these beautiful formations, and many regarded them with quiet fascination. Children occasionally traced the icy designs with curious fingers before warmth from the newly revived fire caused them to disappear. Such fleeting moments added unexpected beauty to otherwise harsh winter mornings. Even the family dog often understood the nightly routine. As blankets were spread and the fire settled into glowing embers, the dog circled several times before lying down in its favorite place, sometimes beside the hearth and sometimes close to its owners. Cats preferred the warm ashes long after visible flames had vanished, stretching comfortably where stones beneath the fireplace still held the day's heat. Animals adapted alongside humans, finding their own ways to survive the freezing nights. The arrival of sunrise rarely ended the cold immediately. Instead, daylight slowly revealed a world covered in sparkling frost, frozen puddles, and smoke rising from dozens of nearby chimneys. Each thin column of smoke told the same story. Another family had awakened. Another fire had been successfully rekindled. Another household had made it safely through the night. Looking across centuries of medieval life, perhaps the most impressive achievement was not the construction of castles or cathedrals, but the quiet knowledge that allowed ordinary families to endure countless winters with limited resources. They understood their homes, their fires, their blankets, their animals, and the changing weather with remarkable precision. Every evening reflected generations of accumulated experience, and every peaceful night's sleep represented the success of hundreds of small decisions made before darkness even arrived. For modern people, warmth appears almost instantly with the turn of a thermostat or the press of a button. For medieval families, warmth had to be earned. It began with trees cut months earlier, wool spun by hand, roofs repaired before the first snowfall, food preserved during autumn, and fires tended with constant attention. By the time a weary farmer finally lay beneath thick blankets on a freezing winter night, countless hours of labor had already gone into making that moment possible. Sleep was never simply the end of the day. It was the reward for careful preparation, shared responsibility, and the enduring determination to face another long winter in a world where nature always held the final word. As winter wore on, people became deeply familiar with the rhythm of the season. They could almost predict how the house would feel at different hours of the night. The warmth gathered after supper would linger for a while. The fire would slowly settle into glowing embers. The room would grow steadily cooler after midnight, and the cold would reach its sharpest edge just before sunrise. This cycle repeated so consistently that many families adjusted their evening routines without even thinking about it. Extra blankets might be pulled over the bed before sleeping rather than waiting until the middle of the night, and a final log was often added to the fire at precisely the right moment to stretch its warmth for another hour or two. The floor of a medieval home could become painfully cold during winter. In houses with stone floors, the chill seemed to rise upward through bare feet. Even packed earth floors became hard and icy after days of freezing weather. Rushes, straw, woven mats, and animal skins were spread across the ground wherever possible, not only to keep rooms cleaner, but also to provide a thin layer of insulation. The difference was modest, yet every little improvement mattered. Stepping from a warm bed onto frozen stone remained one of the least pleasant moments of the day. Families also discovered that certain corners of the house behaved differently during winter. A bed placed beneath a roof beam might stay slightly warmer because rising heat collected there. Another placed near an exterior wall could remain noticeably colder throughout the night. These observations shaped how furniture was arranged. A room was organized less for appearance than for survival, with each object positioned where it best protected the people living there. The thick curtains surrounding wealthier beds served another purpose, besides trapping heat. They also reduced the amount of cold air stirred whenever someone opened a door. In large houses where servants moved through corridors during the night, every opening of a door allowed freezing air to rush inside. Bed curtains acted almost like a second room within the bedroom, creating a protected pocket where warmth remained even if the larger chamber became cold. During especially severe winters, some rivers and lakes froze so completely that familiar landscapes changed entirely. Roads became blocked by snow while frozen waterways turned into temporary paths. Travelers crossing these icy surfaces returned with stories of bitter winds sweeping across open water, grateful to reach the warmth of an inn or farmhouse before nightfall. Their arrival often brought exciting news from distant villages, giving families fresh stories to discuss. Before settling into bed, people rarely owned many changes of clothing, making careful maintenance essential throughout winter. Socks were dried beside the fire each evening and mended whenever holes appeared. Gloves worn while gathering firewood were repaired repeatedly because cold hands made even simple tasks difficult. Cloaks accumulated patches over the years, each one representing another season survived. These garments did not merely protect against bad weather. They often determined whether someone could work comfortably enough to provide for the household. The simple act of climbing into bed required planning. If someone entered too early, the bedding might still feel unpleasantly cold despite warming stones or bedpans. Waiting too long, however, meant allowing the room itself to become colder as the fire died down. Most families gradually learned the ideal moment when the blankets retained enough warmth from preparation, but the household had finished its evening tasks. Many medieval recipes reflected the need to stay warm overnight. Thick barley porridge, oat gruel, bean stews, cabbage soup, and dark bread provided filling meals that digested slowly through the night. Butter, cheese, and preserved meats added valuable calories during winter, when fresh food became scarce. Though medieval people lacked knowledge of modern nutrition, generations of experience taught them that hearty evening meals helped people rest more comfortably during freezing nights. Snowfall also altered the way sound traveled outdoors. A village after fresh snow seemed wrapped in silence. The usual noises of carts, livestock, and footsteps became softer, while distant sounds carried more clearly across the frozen landscape. Someone lying awake beneath heavy blankets might hear a church bell from several miles away, or the faint howl of wolves echoing through nearby forests. These sounds reminded people that although they rested safely indoors, the natural world beyond their walls remained harsh and unpredictable. Many homes contained simple wooden pegs, driven into the walls near the fire. Cloaks, hats, belts, and gloves hung there drying overnight. Steam rose gently from damp garments as the fire warmed them, filling the room with the earthy scent of wet wool and leather. By morning, most clothing was dry enough for another day outdoors. During particularly cold spells, however, thicker garments sometimes remained damp for several days, despite constant drying. Sleep itself became a form of recovery from winter labor. Chopping frozen wood demanded tremendous effort, carrying buckets of water from partially frozen wells, strained muscles already stiff from the cold, feeding livestock, clearing snow from pathways, repairing damaged fences, and maintaining roofs burdened every household. By evening, physical exhaustion often outweighed discomfort. Even lumpy mattresses and smoky rooms could not keep tired workers awake for long. Village life encouraged cooperation during winter because no family remained entirely independent. If one household lost its roof during a storm, neighbors gathered to repair it before another snowfall arrived. If someone fell ill, nearby families sometimes shared meals or collected extra firewood. These acts of cooperation quietly improved everyone's chances of surviving until spring. The warmth of a community could be nearly as valuable as the warmth of a fireplace. For children born during winter, their earliest memories likely included the glow of the hearth, the rough texture of wool blankets, and the comforting presence of family sleeping nearby. They grew up believing these conditions were entirely normal because they had never experienced anything different. As they matured, they naturally assumed responsibility for the same winter routines their parents had followed before them, continuing traditions that stretched back through countless generations. As February slowly approached and daylight lengthened by only a few minutes each evening, hope quietly returned. People noticed subtle changes almost before they realized it. The afternoon sun lingered a little longer above the horizon. Snow dripping from rooftops suggested warmer days would eventually come. Birds became slightly more active, and livestock sensed the approaching change of season. Although freezing nights still continued, the certainty that winter would eventually end lifted spirits throughout the village. Yet no one relaxed too soon. Experienced elders warned that some of the fiercest snowstorms arrived late in the season, catching careless families by surprise. Firewood continued to be rationed carefully, blankets remained stacked high upon every bed, and evening routines changed very little until true spring had firmly arrived. Looking back across the Middle Ages, winter sleep tells a larger story than simply how people stayed warm. It reveals a society built upon patience, preparation, and adaptation. Every woven blanket represented weeks of labor. Every stack of firewood reflected months of planning. Every sturdy roof, carefully sealed shutter, and glowing ember symbolized countless generations learning through experience how to live alongside one of nature's greatest challenges. Night after night, beneath skies filled with stars and surrounded by silent snow, covered fields, medieval families entrusted their lives to little more than timber walls, woolen blankets, a faithful fire, and the comforting presence of those sleeping beside them. In a world without modern comforts, those simple things were often enough to carry them safely through another freezing winter until the welcome warmth of spring finally returned once again. Winter nights also changed the pace of human conversation. During the busy months of planting and harvesting, people often ended the day too tired to speak for long before falling asleep. But in the heart of winter, although there was still plenty of work, evenings sometimes unfolded more slowly. Families gathered around the glowing hearth, watching flames dance across blackened cooking pots while hands busied themselves with sewing, carving wooden tools, spinning wool, or repairing fishing nets. Stories flowed naturally in the warmth of the firelight, and children listened carefully as older relatives described winters they had survived decades earlier. Every tale carried practical wisdom hidden within it, teaching younger generations how to recognize dangerous weather, conserve precious supplies, or avoid mistakes that could prove costly during the coldest months. As bedtime approached, each member of the household performed familiar tasks almost without thinking. Someone folded the benches away from the fire. Another covered leftover food to protect it from mice. The youngest children were wrapped in additional layers before becoming too sleepy to help themselves. The oldest family member often checked the door one final time, pressing firmly against the wooden beam that held it shut. These quiet routines created a sense of order before the darkness of another winter night settled over the village. The glow from the hearth slowly became softer as larger flames disappeared, leaving only glowing red embers beneath a blanket of grey ash. Those embers fascinated people. A single careless movement could scatter sparks across the floor, yet a carefully managed bed of glowing coals might remain alive until morning. Many households considered preserving the fire overnight almost an art. Experienced adults understood exactly how much ash should cover the embers, how closely the remaining logs should rest together, and when the fire had reached the perfect balance between burning too quickly and dying completely. For families living near forests, the sounds outside often reflected the changing seasons. During warmer months, insects filled the night with constant movement. But winter brought long stretches of silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of branches under heavy snow. Sometimes a fox crossed the frozen ground outside, leaving delicate footprints that children discovered the following morning. At other times, deer approached villages searching for food, their tracks winding quietly between houses before disappearing into nearby woods. Although most people remained asleep while these visitors passed, the evidence of their presence greeted them at sunrise. Some medieval houses had lofts where grain, tools, or extra bedding was stored above the main living area. Warm air rising from the fire below made these upper spaces slightly more comfortable than the ground floor, though they could also become smoky because of the open hearth. Older children occasionally slept in these lofts, climbing simple wooden ladders before bedtime and curling beneath piles of blankets surrounded by sacks of grain and bundles of dried herbs stored for winter use. Even during sleep, people remained aware of the fire's importance. Someone waking naturally in the middle of the night often glanced toward the hearth before closing their eyes again. The sight of glowing embers brought reassurance. Complete darkness where the fire should have been could cause immediate concern, especially during severe weather. In many homes, checking the hearth became as instinctive as checking that the door remained locked. The long nights also influenced how people thought about time. Without clocks in ordinary homes, hours were measured by experience rather than exact numbers. Someone might say they awoke when the fire had nearly died, or before the first rooster crowed instead of describing a specific hour. Winter sleep followed natural rhythms guided by fading embers, moonlight through shutters, distant church bells, and eventually the pale glow of dawn spreading across the horizon. Many medieval communities believed that sharing warmth carried moral significance as well as practical value. Religious teachings encouraged generosity toward travelers, the poor, and the elderly, particularly during harsh winters. Allowing someone to spend the night beside the household fire was considered an act of charity with profound spiritual importance. Even families possessing very little often found space for one more person beneath a shared blanket. If the alternative meant facing freezing temperatures alone, children sometimes awoke before sunrise and watched tiny clouds of their own breath drift through the cold air above their blankets. To them, it could seem almost magical. They traced patterns on frosted shutters, listened to the wind outside, and waited impatiently for adults to rekindle the fire. Those first moments after fresh flames appeared transformed the room. Orange light flickered across wooden walls, shadows retreated into corners, and slowly the biting chill gave way to comforting warmth. Winter also demanded patience. Snowstorms occasionally prevented anyone from leaving home for several days. Families depended entirely upon whatever food, water, and fuel had already been stored inside. During such times, the house became an entire world contained within four walls. Beds served not only as places to sleep, but also as warm places to sit while mending clothing, reading treasured manuscripts in wealthier households, or comforting children frightened by fierce winds outside. The bedding itself gradually absorbed the scent of daily life. Wool carried traces of wood smoke from countless evenings beside the hearth. Linen sheets smelled faintly of the herbs used when they were washed and dried. Feather pillows retained warmth remarkably well after hours beneath sleeping heads. Every blanket reflected years of careful use, repairs, and quiet family history stitched into its worn fabric. People who rose before everyone else often enjoyed a unique moment of stillness. The rest of the household remained asleep beneath heavy blankets while only the first person stirred quietly through the cold room. They knelt beside the hearth, gently blew upon fading embers, and watched as tiny sparks brightened into glowing orange once again. Thin curls of smoke rose upward before the first small flames finally appeared. In many ways, this daily ritual symbolized hope itself. However cold the night had been, the fire could live again. As the months passed, winter slowly surrendered its grip. Icicles hanging from rooftops became shorter. Streams hidden beneath thick ice began flowing once more. The frozen ground softened little by little beneath the afternoon sun. Families still slept beneath heavy blankets for many weeks, but each passing night carried the quiet promise that spring was drawing closer. For medieval people, surviving winter was never the result of a single invention or extraordinary discovery. It depended upon hundreds of ordinary habits repeated faithfully every day. Gathering enough wood before autumn ended, repairing blankets instead of throwing them away, keeping animals healthy through the cold months, protecting the fire, sharing warmth instead of sleeping alone, watching the weather, conserving food, caring for neighbors. None of these actions seemed remarkable by themselves. Yet together they formed a complete way of life that allowed entire communities to endure winters year after year. When modern people imagine a medieval winter night, it is easy to focus only on the cold, but inside those humble timber houses, illuminated by the gentle glow of a hearth, there was also resilience, routine, cooperation, and quiet determination. Beneath layers of wool, surrounded by family, with the crackling fire slowly fading into glowing embers, countless ordinary people closed their eyes, knowing they had done everything possible to prepare for the darkness ahead. And when the first light of morning finally filtered through frost-covered shutters, they rose once more, grateful not simply for another day, but for another night successfully endured in one of history's most demanding seasons. The changing phases of the moon subtly influenced winter nights as well. On evenings, when a full moon rose above the snow-covered countryside, this pale light reflected so brilliantly from the frozen ground that the landscape seemed almost to glow. A person looking through the cracks in the shutters might see rooftops, bare trees, and silent fields bathed in silver. During a new moon, however, darkness became almost absolute once the fire burned low. The world beyond the house simply disappeared into blackness, reminding everyone how isolated a single home could feel in the vast winter countryside. The wind itself had many personalities. A gentle breeze produced a soft whisper round the roof that could almost lull someone to sleep. Stronger winds rattled shutters and made loose wooden boards tremble. During violent winter storms, gusts forced smoke back into the room through the roof opening, filling the house with a thicker haze until the wind changed direction again. Families often recognized approaching storms simply by listening to how the wind sounded against the walls before they even stepped outside. Not every family possessed a proper bed frame. Some of the poorest households slept on simple pallets laid directly upon the floor, consisting of sacks stuffed with straw, leaves, or dried grasses. Before bedtime, these makeshift beds were carefully arranged near the warmest part of the room, and every available blanket was piled on top. During the day, the bedding could be rolled up and stored against the wall, allowing the small living space to serve many different purposes. Although humble, these sleeping places still benefited from the warmth generated by the household fire and the close presence of family members nearby. Even hair played a small role in keeping warm. Many women braided their long hair before bed to prevent it from tangling beneath blankets, while men sometimes wore simple linen or wool caps over shorter hair to trap additional warmth. Sleeping caps became particularly common because the head often remained exposed while the rest of the body stayed beneath layers of blankets. A warm cap required little material to make, but added noticeable comfort during freezing nights. People also understood the value of staying active before bedtime. Sitting motionless for too long beside the fire allowed the body to cool gradually despite the warmth of the room. Many continued small tasks until the very last moment: sewing, carving, grinding grain, twisting rope, or repairing baskets. These activities kept blood circulating and helped them climb into bed already warm, making it easier for blankets to retain that heat through the first part of the night. For families who kept bees, honey remained one of winter's treasured comforts. A spoonful stirred into warm herbal drinks before bed added sweetness that was otherwise difficult to find during the colder months. Honey also featured in many traditional remedies for sore throats and coughs, ailments that often became more common as people spent long weeks breathing smoky indoor air. The smell of winter itself became familiar inside medieval homes. Freshly split firewood released the scent of sap. Damp wool steamed gently beside the hearth after a snowy day outdoors. Loaves of dark bread, baked earlier, filled the room with warmth long after they left the oven. Herbs hanging from rafters slowly dried in the rising heat above the fireplace, filling the air with subtle fragrances of thyme, sage, rosemary, or lavender. These comforting smells blended together until they became inseparable from memories of winter evenings. Occasionally, heavy snow blocked sunlight from reaching small windows, making rooms surprisingly dim even during daytime. Candles were still used sparingly, so people often arranged their work as close as possible to the doorway or window where natural light remained strongest. By evening, however, everyone naturally drifted back toward the fire, whose glow provided both warmth and enough light to finish simple tasks. Some medieval households owned treasured family quilts assembled from pieces of older clothing. Every patch carried its own history. A square might come from a grandfather's worn cloak, another from a child's outgrown tunic, another from a mother's faded apron. These quilts not only conserved valuable fabric, but also trapped warm air between their stitched layers. Over generations, they became practical heirlooms, carrying memories of family members long after the original garments had disappeared. The elderly often became the storytellers of winter, because they had accumulated decades of memories from seasons both harsh and mild. Around the evening fire, they described winters when rivers froze earlier than anyone expected, years when wolves wandered dangerously close to villages, or storms that buried entire roads beneath towering drifts. Younger listeners absorbed these stories with fascination, learning that every winter demanded respect regardless of how mild it first appeared. The household clock, in a sense, was the fire itself. Bright flames marked the early evening. Steady glowing logs signaled bedtime. Red embers indicated the middle of the night. Cool grey ashes announced that morning work needed to begin immediately. Long before affordable clocks reached ordinary homes, people judged the passing hours by watching their hearth change through the darkness. Morning routines rarely began with conversation. Everyone instinctively focused on restoring warmth. Someone stirred the embers, another fetched fresh firewood. Water was placed over the flames to heat. Only after the room slowly grew warmer did ordinary conversation resume. This quiet cooperation reflected years of shared experience. Every member of the household understood exactly what needed to be done without receiving instructions. Winter also encouraged gratitude for surprisingly ordinary things. A roof that did not leak, dry boots waiting beside the fire, a blanket without holes, enough oats for another pot of porridge, a healthy cow still producing milk. These small blessings carried immense value, because each one made another freezing night easier to endure. Comfort was measured not by luxury, but by security. Even after surviving dozens of winters, experienced adults never underestimated the season. They knew cold weather rewarded preparation and punished carelessness. Leaving firewood outdoors instead of under shelter might leave it too wet to burn. Forgetting to repair a roof before snowfall could result in weeks of damp bedding. Allowing the fire to burn too fiercely one evening might waste fuel desperately needed later in the month. Winter demanded constant attention to details that seemed insignificant during warmer seasons. By late winter, blankets and clothing often showed clear signs of months of hard use. Edges became frayed. Knees of woolen trousers grew thin from kneeling beside the hearth. Mittens developed fresh patches where they had worn through while carrying rough logs. Rather than replacing these items, families patiently repaired them once again, knowing they would still be needed during the next cold season. Looking back across the centuries, the medieval winter bedroom was not merely a place for sleep. It was the final refuge after a day spent battling cold winds, frozen ground, and endless practical challenges. Thick blankets represented months of spinning and weaving. The fire reflected forests carefully managed and wood painstakingly gathered. Every warm stone placed beneath the covers, every shutter closed against the wind, every handful of straw added to a mattress reflected generations of practical knowledge, refined through experience. As snow continued falling quietly beyond the walls, families drifted into sleep with confidence born not from comfort alone, but from preparation, perseverance, and the timeless understanding that another winter night could always be endured one ember, one blanket, and one sunrise at a time. As one winter blended into the next, entire generations grew up without ever questioning these nightly customs. A child who watched their grandmother carefully tuck wool blankets around the family before bed would likely repeat the exact same movements decades later with their own children. The techniques were rarely written down. Instead, they survived through observation, imitation, and countless quiet evenings spent beside the hearth. In many ways, the knowledge of how to sleep through a freezing winter was passed from one generation to another, just as faithfully as family names or treasured possessions. The walls themselves slowly recorded the passing of winter. Smoke rising from open hearths darkened wooden beams year after year, leaving them almost black with soot. Although modern people might consider this a sign of poor ventilation, that layer of soot became part of the familiar appearance of medieval homes. Looking upward while lying in bed, a person often saw heavy roof timbers disappearing into shadows, stained by decades of winter fires that had warmed the same family for generations. The rhythm of snowfall shaped emotions as much as daily work. The first snow of the season often brought excitement, especially among children eager to play outside before the cold drove them back indoors. Weeks later, however, endless white landscapes could begin to feel overwhelming. Roads disappeared beneath deep drifts. Familiar fields became featureless blankets of snow, and the world beyond the village seemed distant and unreachable. In those moments, the warm glow of the family hearth became even more precious, because it represented stability in a landscape transformed by winter. Some families kept simple wooden stools beside the bed, not only as convenient places for clothing, but also to keep boots away from damp floors. Leather absorbed moisture easily, and frozen boots became stiff enough to make walking uncomfortable the following morning. Placing footwear on raised wooden surfaces helped preserve both warmth and durability. Such small habits reflected centuries of practical experience rather than written instruction. Even silence had its own texture during winter nights. There were moments when every member of the household slept. The fire glowed quietly beneath its blanket of ash, and no wind stirred outside. These rare periods of complete stillness were broken only by the occasional settling of the wooden house or the soft breathing of those asleep beneath heavy blankets. For a brief time, the entire home seemed suspended between the fading warmth of yesterday and the coming work of tomorrow. Many people ended each day with familiar prayers asking for protection through the night. Winter made such prayers especially meaningful because darkness lasted so long and dangers felt closer. Families prayed for the health of children, for enough food to last until spring, for the safety of livestock sleeping in nearby shelters, and for the strength to endure whatever weather awaited them by morning. Faith offered comfort alongside fire and blankets, providing reassurance when nature seemed beyond human control. During particularly cold winters, people sometimes noticed unusual patterns of frost inside their homes. Tiny crystals formed delicate shapes across wooden shutters. Water buckets developed thin sheets of ice despite being indoors. And metal tools left too close to outside walls felt painfully cold to the touch. Children occasionally treated these frozen patterns almost like artwork, examining their intricate shapes before the morning fire slowly melted them away. The smallest member of the household often received special attention during bedtime. Infants were checked repeatedly to ensure blankets had not shifted, while older children who kicked off their covers during sleep were quietly tucked back beneath them without being fully awakened. Parents accepted interrupted sleep as part of winter life, knowing that a few moments spent adjusting blankets could prevent hours of discomfort before dawn. The smell of breakfast often became the first sign that winter night had finally ended. Long before sunlight filled the room, someone stirred oats into simmering water or reheated yesterday's stew above the newly revived fire. The aroma drifted gently through the house, gradually waking the remaining sleepers. Hunger and warmth together encouraged everyone to leave the comfort of bed, despite the cold still lingering in the room. The long winter season also strengthened patience. There was no quick solution to freezing weather, no machine capable of warming every room instantly. Comfort arrived slowly. The fire needed time to catch. Frozen clothing softened only gradually beside the hearth. Medieval people became accustomed to waiting, understanding that nearly every task during winter unfolded at its own pace. Even the family cat seemed to understand this rhythm. After spending the night curled beside the warmest stones of the fireplace, it stretched lazily as fresh flames returned, blinking sleepily before wandering through the slowly warming house. Dogs often waited patiently beside the door, ready to accompany their owners into the snowy morning, despite having spent the night enjoying the same precious warmth as the rest of the household. By late evening each day, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys created a familiar sight across medieval villages. Every thin column curling into the cold sky represented another household preparing for nightfall. Behind each chimney stood families repeating nearly identical routines, adding one last log to the fire, checking shutters, folding blankets, comforting restless children, feeding animals, whispering prayers, and finally settling beneath layers of wool as darkness spread across the countryside. Winter nights also reminded people how closely their lives depended upon nature. A healthy forest meant enough firewood. A successful autumn harvest meant full grain stores. Strong sheep produced thick wool for warmer blankets. Healthy livestock provided milk, meat, and hides that improved survival through the coldest months. Every comfortable night's sleep reflected work, completed long before winter itself had arrived. Visitors from warmer regions often remarked upon how differently northern communities approached the season. Those accustomed to milder climates sometimes struggled during their first harsh winter, while local families seemed almost instinctively prepared. They knew exactly how to stack firewood so it stayed dry beneath snow, how to hang damp clothing where it would dry most quickly, how to recognize the warning signs of approaching storms, and how to arrange sleeping spaces for maximum warmth. These skills appeared ordinary only because they had been practiced for generations. There were undoubtedly nights when sleep came reluctantly. A howling storm might shake the roof for hours. Worry over dwindling food supplies could keep someone awake. An ill child coughing beside the fire might prevent the entire family from resting deeply. Medieval life offered no guarantee of peaceful sleep, yet people continued following the same routines, because those habits gave them the greatest chance of enduring whatever challenges the season presented. As the final weeks of winter slowly passed, the first noticeably warmer evenings felt almost miraculous. Families sometimes realized they no longer needed quite as many blankets. The fire could burn slightly lower without making the room unbearably cold. Windows remained shuttered at night, but daylight lingered longer each evening, gently reminding everyone that spring was approaching once more. For medieval people, winter sleep represented far more than simply closing their eyes after a day's work. It was the culmination of months of preparation, countless practical skills, strong family cooperation, and deep respect for the natural world. Every carefully mended blanket, every basket of seasoned firewood, every repaired roof tile, every glowing ember preserved beneath ash, contributed to the simple but remarkable achievement of waking safely another morning. In that quiet success lay one of the greatest triumphs of ordinary medieval life: the ability to find warmth, rest, and hope in the middle of a season that offered so little of any of them. As the years passed, people came to judge the success of a winter not by how comfortable it had been, but by how well the household had endured it. If the family still had a small stack of firewood left when the first signs of spring appeared, they considered their planning successful. If the blankets had lasted another season, with only a few careful repairs, they had done well. If everyone had remained healthy enough to work once warmer weather returned, then the hardships of winter had been overcome. Sleep played a central role in that quiet success, because every peaceful night restored the strength needed to face another demanding day. Many medieval homes also had low ceilings compared to modern buildings. While this may have made rooms feel cramped, less empty space meant less air that needed to be warmed by the fire. Heat collected more easily inside smaller rooms, making them noticeably more comfortable than large open halls. Wealthy castles often looked magnificent, yet many ordinary cottages were actually easier to keep warm because of their modest size. When families prepared for bed, they often spoke softly, not wishing to wake children who had already fallen asleep beside the fire. The youngest members of the household were sometimes carried to bed wrapped in blankets, without ever opening their eyes. Adults moved carefully through the dim room, guided more by memory than by sight. Every piece of furniture occupied a familiar place, allowing people to navigate almost instinctively, even when the only light came from fading embers. Winter also changed the way people valued daylight. Every extra minute of sunshine became precious. Chores requiring natural light were completed as quickly as possible before darkness returned. Once evening arrived, people accepted that the day was ending, gathering around the hearth instead of trying to continue working by candlelight. This natural rhythm allowed many to sleep longer during winter than they did in summer, giving their bodies additional time to recover from months of physical labor. The blankets themselves became warmer as the night progressed. At first, they merely protected against the cold bedding beneath, but gradually they trapped enough body heat to create a comfortable pocket of warm air around the sleeper. Medieval people understood this feeling well. They knew the first few minutes in bed might be unpleasantly chilly. Yet patience would soon be rewarded as warmth slowly built beneath the layers of wool and linen. Snow falling onto thatched roofs created another unexpected benefit. Thick layers of snow trapped air between their crystals, acting like natural insulation. A roof covered by fresh snow often allowed less heat to escape than one exposed directly to icy winds. Families could not explain the science behind this effect, but they certainly noticed that some snowy nights seemed slightly warmer indoors. Despite the frozen world outside, people also became skilled at recognizing different kinds of fire. A lively evening fire filled the room with bright flames, encouraging conversation and work. A sleeping fire, by contrast, consisted mostly of glowing embers, carefully arranged beneath ash. The goal was no longer bright light, but slow, steady warmth, lasting until dawn. Managing these two very different fires required experience passed quietly from one generation to another. Occasionally, someone awoke after hearing snow slide from the roof in the middle of the night. The sudden sound could resemble distant thunder, briefly startling everyone before silence returned. After a moment of listening, reassured that nothing dangerous had happened, the household settled back into sleep. Such sounds became familiar enough that most adults hardly reacted after experiencing them through many winters. The seasons also influenced the appearance of people's hands. By winter, fingers often became rough from chopping wood, carrying water, repairing fences, and handling frozen tools. Before bed, some rubbed small amounts of animal fat or homemade ointments into cracked skin to reduce painful splitting caused by cold weather. These simple remedies offered modest relief before another day of work began. Many villagers organized life around the certainty that winter would eventually return every year. New houses were built with fireplaces, placed where they could warm the greatest portion of the home. Forests were managed carefully so future generations would still have firewood. Sheep were valued not only for meat but also for the wool that became winter clothing and bedding. Even children understood that preparing for next winter began almost as soon as the previous one ended. Inside the house, darkness encouraged listening rather than watching. People recognized the footsteps of family members simply by the sound of wooden shoes crossing the floor. They knew who had risen to stir the fire without needing to open their eyes. The crackling of different woods, the shifting of blankets, the quiet breathing of sleeping relatives, and the distant whistle of wind through the trees formed a familiar nighttime soundtrack that remained remarkably unchanged from one winter to the next. As dawn approached, frost often sparkled across the edges of doors and windows. The first person awake sometimes brushed away thin layers of ice before opening the shutters. Pale sunlight entered slowly, revealing tiny particles of smoke drifting through the room, while everyone else remained wrapped beneath blankets. Outside, the village still appeared frozen, but inside the day's first fire already promised warmth. The arrival of spring did not mean winter habits disappeared overnight. Heavy blankets remained on beds for several weeks because nights stayed cold long after daytime temperatures improved. Families gradually reduced the size of their evening fires, opened shutters earlier, and spent more time outdoors. Yet the lessons of winter remained fresh in everyone's mind. Before long, they would begin gathering firewood again, repairing blankets once more, and preparing for another season they knew would inevitably return. Looking back across the medieval world, it becomes clear that surviving winter nights depended less on wealth than on knowledge. A rich lord with poor preparation could suffer almost as much as a poor farmer while a modest household that carefully stored fuel, repaired clothing, maintained its roof, and worked together often weathered the season surprisingly well. Practical wisdom outweighed luxury in countless small ways. Perhaps that is why medieval winter sleep carries such enduring fascination today. It reminds us that comfort once depended not on technology, but on patience, cooperation, craftsmanship, and respect for nature. Every glowing ember represented careful attention. Every wool blanket reflected months of skilled labor. Every peaceful night's sleep was earned through preparation rather than convenience. When the household finally drifted into silence and the last visible flame disappeared beneath glowing ash, the medieval home became a tiny island of warmth surrounded by a vast frozen landscape. Snow covered the fields, forest stood motionless beneath starlit skies, and icy winds swept across empty roads where no traveller dared wander until morning. Yet within those simple timber walls, families rested together, protected by little more than thick blankets, steady embers, and generations of hard-earned knowledge. Night after night, winter after winter, this quiet ritual continued almost unchanged, allowing ordinary people to endure one of the harshest seasons of the medieval world with remarkable resilience and unwavering determination.